Hello everyone, welcome to our PMP exam question and answer solving session for June 2026. Now, if you are preparing for the PMP exam, you can use today's class to assess how well you are prepared for the exam, okay? So out of the 5 questions that we are going to solve today, the target will be to get all the 5 out of the 5 questions correct. However, the minimum expectation is that you should get at least 4 out of the 5 questions correct to consider yourself fairly well prepared for the PMP exam. Now, anything less than that, you might need a bit more preparation, okay? Also, if you are preparing for the PMP exam, you might want to check out my training courses on Udemy, and you can also consider to join my YouTube membership community. All of them are very well reviewed amongst the students like you, and I will provide all the details on how you can join the same later on in this video, okay? So give this video a like, get a pen and a paper, and let's get started with question number 1.
Right, so question number 1, guys, please read the question and try to answer it before we solve this together. You can pause the video here if you wish to. Right, so let's get started. A project has the following characteristics, okay? To identify the best approach for construction, a site assessment was conducted. Next, a change request was approved, okay? The word of the question here is approved, okay? To shift the project location, which of course contradicts the findings of the original site assessment. So what happened was there was a change request which was approved, okay, which let's say mandated the shift of the project location from, let's say, X to Y. However, initially when the project charter was signed off, it had location X, and now there is a new location Y, which is of course followed through a proper change request, and it has been approved, okay? So it is very important thing to consider as part of this question. And finally, risk and data analysis was conducted before the change request was approved. Okay, so the question is, which action should the project manager take? Option A, proceed with the change request, reject the change request, request a detailed report of the risk analysis, request a new site assessment for the proposed location. Now, mind here, guys, that whenever you are project manager and when there is a change request which has been approved, and when I mean approved, it is approved by your project sponsor, we can take it for a valid assumption. Okay, it has been approved by PMO. It has gone through a proper change management process. So as a project manager, whatever you personally think in terms of the change of this location doesn't matter, because since the change request is now approved, you should proceed with the change request in terms of the implementation. So the correct answer to this question is option A. Of course, you cannot reject the change request. That is totally outright, let's say, felony in terms of general project management. Let's say option C, request a detailed report of the risk analysis. You can do that, but that doesn't change anything because the change request has already been approved, guys. Okay, if it is approved, you have to ensure that it has followed through the right procedures, right approval channels, right escalation matrices, etc., etc. And that is why option C is also incorrect. Let's look at option D, which is to request a new site assessment for the proposed location. Again, a pointless exercise. You can do some intellectualization in terms of understanding why this location changed from X to Y, but again, it is for your own knowledge, but that doesn't change the situation that the change request has been approved. It is now part of your project scope. Your scope baseline is updated, and you need to start executing the project in terms of this approved change request specifications that has come your way. Okay, so the correct answer to this question is option A.
Now, if you are preparing for your PMP exam, guys, I would suggest that you check out my PMP exam preparation courses on Udemy. All the courses are very highly rated amongst the students, and many PMP aspirants like you have passed their PMP exam with the help of these courses. You can check the student reviews on Udemy, and all the links will be provided in the description section of this video in case you are interested to join. Okay, and now let's move on to question number 2.
Right, so question number 2, guys. This is the question. So this is another question which will again start the debate that, okay, how much memorization is required for the PMP exam. So if you have not watched my memorization video, I would strongly recommend that you go and check that video as well. Okay, so that is an important aspect which you need to keep in mind for your PMP exam in terms of understanding then how much do you really need to memorize for your PMP exam, and to solve such questions which you see on screen now, how much memorization you need. Okay, so let's solve this question. I'll pause here take a shot at it before we come back and solve this together. Right, so let's get started. The project manager is reviewing the following 12-month trailing cost performance index, which is CPI trend chart for a project. Okay, so you see that it is from month 1 to month 12. So that's a trailing 12-month performance indicator. So for example, if you are on month 13, you are reviewing the performance of the project in terms of CPI, which is cost performance index from month 1 till month 12. Okay, what should be your best course of action in this scenario? And there are 4 options provided. Now, to answer this question, guys, you tell me how much calculation or how much formula memorization is required, right? It is near to 0, right? Because to answer this question, at least from, let's say, a mathematical standpoint, what you only need to know is the formula of CPI, which is earned value, okay, which is EV. Okay, so EV by actual cost AC, right? So that is the formula of CPI. Now, the inference part, which is more critical, and that's where the PMP exam will focus, is that when a CPI is greater than 1, okay, what does it mean? Okay, it means that your earned value, your numerator, is greater than your actual cost, which is denominator, okay, which means that you are doing good in your project or you are exceeding the cost performance baseline of your project. Okay, so basically you are underspending. Okay, so you are doing good in your project. However, if the cost performance index is less than 1, what does it mean? It means that your actual cost is high and it is higher than your earned value. So you are actually overspending in your project. And from a metric standpoint, your project is red when it comes to cost performance. Okay, so CPI less than 1 is a bad scenario. CPI greater than 1 is a good scenario if we oversimplify the interpretation of CPI. Now, if you see this project, which has started from month 1 and moving on to month 12, you see that for the first few months, okay, which is from month 1 to, let's say, month 5, the CPI was greater than 1, okay, which means the project was performing well. However, from month 6 onwards, there is a downward trend in your cost performance index chart. Okay, so it is going down, 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 and down. Okay, so that means the project at the point of month 12 is at a CPI of 0.78, which is like pretty bad. Okay, so which means that you have grossly overspent in your project. Now, once you have understood this chart, you are now in a good position to look at the answer options. Okay, what should be the best course of action in this scenario? Option 1, put forward a change request for additional resources. Okay, this is incorrect because putting additional resources means that there is a highly likely scenario that there will be additional cost coming with the resources as well. Whether it is outsourced, it is also definitely then an additional cost because you need to pay the external company or the supplier who will be providing you the resources. Even if it is internal within the company, the salary or let's say the cost of those resources will be cross-charged to your project. If you have been a project manager, you know how it works, how cross-charges works between departments to departments. Okay, so definitely adding a scenario will add cost to your project, and that is a far worse situation to have compared to what you are already in the current scenario. So that is why option A is incorrect. Let's look at option B, crash the project timeline. This is also incorrect because if you have studied your PMP exam syllabus, you know that crashing almost always comes with a upcharge in your cost. Okay, and also there are issues with respect to quality, there are risks with respect to scope, etc., etc. Okay, so those are secondary aspects, but the primary aspect of crashing which you need to know is crashing almost always comes with additional cost. Okay, so that is why option B is also incorrect because you cannot select an option which will involve additional cost because that will take your cost performance index further down, right? So that is why option B is incorrect. Let's look at option C. Plan to utilize management reserve funds. Okay, so you may say that, okay, Ray, I'll be using the management reserve funds and I will be supplying the, let's say, deficit from this management reserve funds. Let's hold this option for now. Option D, put forward a change request to revise the cost baseline. Okay, this is also a plausible option that you can put forward and say that, hey, look, whatever analysis I have done, it has come to light that we will not be able to meet this deficit. And that is why I need some extra funds to meet this deficit. And this is my exception report or my one pager to support that. However, if you look at option C and option D now, and if you look closely at option C, what it is essentially saying is you use your management reserve funds. Now, you need to understand what is a management reserve fund. So let's first quickly go and understand what is a management reserve. Okay, now if you look at this picture which you see on screen now, you will see that the management reserve is something which is over and above your cost baseline. Okay, you will see such kind of a diagram in your process group practice guide as well. Okay, so what you need to understand from this diagram is your overall contingency reserve is within your remit as a project manager, but however, if you are going to involve your management to mobilize this management reserve, that will require a greater level of escalation, and you definitely need to go through a change management procedure to mobilize these management reserve funds. Okay, now your situation as a project manager is much better off to use the contingency reserves first before going into the management reserves. Okay, that is all you need to know from a concept standpoint with respect to your understanding of management reserves versus contingency reserves. Now if you go back to this question, option C is telling that you need to utilize your management reserve funds. Okay, so that is definitely incorrect. So the correct answer to this question is option D, which is to put forward a change request to revise the cost baseline, and once that change request is approved, you can revise the cost baseline, and of course you can use your contingency reserves. Okay, mind it, not the management reserves but the contingency reserves to pull in some money which is required to meet this deficit. Okay, so the correct answer to this question is option D. Now one thing before we close off this question, guys, if you see at option D, which is telling you to put forward a change request to revise the cost baseline, this is an option which if you see in isolation might look to you as not a good option, right? Because someone might argue, if they look at this option on a standalone perspective and not in context with the other options, someone can argue that okay, change request is my last resort because I'm revising the cost baseline and it is a strict no for the project manager unless absolutely necessary. Okay, agreed, that is correct. Okay, but that is only correct if you view this statement of option D in isolation. However, as we have discussed in our previous monthly sessions, that when you solve a PMP question, you should always look at an option with respect to context of the other options as well. Okay, because in your PMP exam, you are not expected to select the right answer. Okay, mark my words very carefully, guys. You are not expected to select the right answer, but you are expected to select the best possible answer. So there is a very fine line of difference between a right answer and a best possible answer. Okay, so going by that understanding, we have safely eliminated option A, option B, and option C on solid grounds. And that is why the correct answer to this question is D, which is probably not ideal, but going by the 4 options that we have, this is the best option we can go for as part of this question solving scenario. Okay, so the correct answer is option D.
Now, before we move on to question number 3, guys, I would suggest that you check out my membership community on YouTube as part of your PMP exam preparation. I share daily posts on PMP exam tips, tricks, and strategies via this platform. It's a monthly subscription based service, okay, and you can cancel anytime you want to. All the links will be provided in the description section of this video, so please do check it out. Okay, and now let's move on to question number 3. Right, so question number 3, guys, the drill will remain the same. Please read the question and try to answer it before we solve this together. You can pause the video here if you wish to. Okay, so let's get started. Multiple stakeholders expressed dissatisfaction during the system testing phase of a digital transformation project, indicating that the delivery functionality does not align with their anticipated outcomes. What could the project manager leverage to prevent this issue in the future? Okay, so that's the key term that you need to refer to in the question stem, that the question is actually asking that what could be some preventive measures the project manager can take, not for this situation, but to manage the situation in the future. So that's a very, very key difference which you need to take into consideration when you are evaluating the answer choice. Okay, because the way you will react to a situation which is now or which you need to address now at present for this project will be very different from a issue resolution technique which you will need to sort of action if you are planning something as a learn from experience which you need to sort of solve for future, or sort of share as a learn from experience for future projects. Okay, so let's look at the options one by one. Option A, stakeholder engagement strategies. Possibly, okay, because you have multiple stakeholders who has expressed dissatisfaction, so probably might be that you have not engaged them properly. Okay, so you need to probably plan something around it. So looks like a plausible option. Option B, risk mitigation strategies or risk mitigation approaches. Okay, very, very broad option, guys. Okay, because risk mitigation, while you can remotely link it to, okay, this was also a risk of stakeholders expressing dissatisfaction, etc., etc. However, it can take into account risks of cost, risks of schedule, risks of communication, risks of scope. Okay, so that's a very, very broad option. Okay, so whenever you are evaluating answer choices, be very careful of evaluating such broad options, which very, very generically might make sense, but very specific to this scenario, bit out of context. Okay, that is why option B is incorrect. Let's look at option C. Issue resolution methodologies, again incorrect answer choice, and that is primarily because issue is something which has already happened. It requires consideration from yourself as a project manager or from your management, and you need to act upon it, right? However, in this situation, the question is asking about what should you do to prevent such kind of an issue in the future. Now, if you have just seen this issue word and linked it back to option C, that okay, there is an issue here and there is issue resolution technique here, that's a very, very sort of childish way of solving questions, and that is actually where the PMP exam will be successfully be able to trick you in terms of selecting the wrong answer choice. Okay, so issue resolution is incorrect because it is something that needs to be addressed for future projects, not for this project, and issue is something which needs to be addressed for this project at this point in time in the present situation. Okay, and that is why issue resolution is an incorrect answer choice in this scenario. And let's look at option D, personal relationship with stakeholders. Again, that is incorrect, right? Because the moment you start bringing these terms such as personal relationship with stakeholders and sort of trying to influence something personally, using your personal equation with that person, these sort of has that red flags of conflict of interest. Okay, so to evaluate these kind of answer choices, you have to be a bit careful. Now, I'm not saying that 100% of the time there will be answer choices which are incorrect, which talks about these personal considerations or personal relationships which you need to bring into projects as a project manager, but mostly generally these type of options are incorrect. However, every option needs to be evaluated in the context of the scenario. Okay, so however, for this scenario, it is definitely evident that having personal relationships with stakeholders is a red flag. It is conflict of interest and should be avoided. Okay, so that is why option D is also incorrect, and the correct answer to this question is option A, which is stakeholder engagement strategies. Now, some of you can argue that Ray, it is also a very broad option. Okay, B was also risk mitigation approaches. Okay, which was also broad option. Why did you reject B? Or on the same time, why have you accepted option A? And the reason for that is, guys, because it has this word of stakeholder engagement. Okay, and the reason for that falling in line with the scenario as provided in the question is that you have multiple stakeholders expressing dissatisfaction. So that is still broad, but it is quite narrowed down within the stakeholder domain at the moment, right? However, risk mitigation is still very, very broad. Okay, and it goes beyond the boundaries of stakeholder management as well. Okay, so that is why the correct answer to this question is option A, which is stakeholder engagement strategies. Now, before we move on to question number 4, guys, make sure you do subscribe to my channel PMP with Ray for more such videos like this for your PMP exam preparation. Okay, your support really helps educational channels like this to grow on YouTube. And now let's move on to question number 4. Right, so question number 4, guys. Please read the scenario, solve the question yourself before we solve this together. You can pause the video here if you wish to. Right, so let's start. An iOS application development team is reassessing the product design after a sharp increase in negative reviews. Okay, it was being found that some of the features of the application were used in a way not envisioned by the product design team. So the end users are using some features of the application in a way which the product design team didn't think of, and that is what is creating a gap in the expectation in the minds of the end users, and that is what is generating the negative reviews for this application. Okay, which agile practice could have prevented this issue from occurring? Okay, now there are 4 options which are provided here: smoke testing, behavior driven development, feature driven development, and information radiators. Okay, now to answer this question correctly, guys, you need to understand each and every term of smoke testing, behavior driven development, feature driven development, and information radiators in context of agile project management. If you know the details of these terms, you'll be able to answer this question in less than 30 seconds, okay? And if you don't know, it will be very difficult for you to answer such knowledge-driven questions in your PMP exam based on Agile correctly, okay? So I would recommend that you watch a few videos on my YouTube channel where I have covered such topics in depth, okay? So it is very important that you have a sound base of the Agile terms and terminologies for your PMP exam. Right, so let's start solving this question, and while doing that, let's evaluate each of these terms in context of the scenario that has been provided, okay? Number one, what is smoke testing? In Agile project management, smoke testing is a type of preliminary testing that is conducted to quickly evaluate whether the most critical functionalities of a software application are working as expected, okay? The primary purpose of smoke testing is to determine if the software build is stable enough for more in-depth testing. Right. So smoke testing is basically a tool which is used in the testing phase of a software application. Here we are not talking about that, right? We are talking about a gap which happened at the design and development stage of the application. So that is why smoke testing is an incorrect answer choice. Let's look at the second option, which is behavior-driven development. What is behavior-driven development? Now, behavior-driven development in Agile is a software development methodology that encourages collaboration among developers, testers, and non-technical stakeholders, which effectively sometimes are the end users, by using natural language to describe the desired behavior of a software system. Now, when we talk of natural language, you have often heard the term called user stories in Agile, right? So that is what we mean by natural language to describe the desired behavior of a software system. So if you're writing the PMP exam, you should know what user stories are in Agile, okay? Behavior-driven development aims to align the development process of the business objectives and improve communication between different roles involved in the development process. Right, so that nicely falls into the scenario that has been described as part of this question, right? So if the behavior-driven development was followed very well in this entire process of application development, keeping the end user in mind through the use of user stories, this kind of situation could have been prevented from occurring, right? So behavior-driven development might be the right answer choice for this question, okay? But anyways, let's hold this option for now and let's evaluate option C and option D. Option C, feature-driven development. What is FDD? So feature-driven development, or FDD, is an iterative and incremental software development methodology that is part of a larger Agile framework, okay? It focuses on delivering tangible working software features within relatively short time frames for a global or a large-scale Agile project. FDD places a strong emphasis on collaboration, domain modeling, and feature-based planning, okay? Now, with that in context, this does not typically fall in the scenario that has been described here, right? Because feature-driven development might be a best practice of Agile that can be used for larger Agile and Scrum frameworks, okay? But here it doesn't link to the context that has been provided in the scenario, okay? It is very important that the right answer choice links to the context that has been provided in the scenario. And feature-driven development doesn't fall in that context, which would give me confidence to think that if FDD was applied, this could have prevented this issue from occurring, which is the gap between the end user and the product design. So that is why feature-driven development is a wrong answer choice, okay? Let's look at option D, information radiators. What are information radiators? Now, in Agile project management, an information radiator is a term used to describe a visible display of project information that is placed in a shared workspace, okay? The purpose of information radiators is to make key project information easily accessible and understandable to everyone involved in the project, which promotes transparency and collaboration. Now note that information radiators could be physical boards as well, or could be virtual boards as well, when the teams are not co-located. And these displays are typically kept at a location which are easily accessible by team members over a virtual network, or typically being mounted in an office area where the team members could easily see them during the project working hours, okay? Now that is information radiators. Now this is definitely a best practice in Agile, but this is something which is totally irrelevant to the scenario that has been provided, okay? So that is why option D is also incorrect. Now having the project burn up chart or the project burn down chart or the team structure as part of the information radiator as part of this project doesn't give us confidence that this could have prevented this gap between the product design department and the end user department happening for this scenario. And that is why option D might be a good practice for agile projects, but it is totally irrelevant to the scenario that has been provided here. Okay. So the correct answer to this question is option B, which is behavior driven development. Now the importance of this question, guys, is to help you understand how critical it is for you to study and understand these core terms and terminologies based on agile for your PMP exam. Okay, so this will be a key building block for your success in the PMP exam, right? And that is how well you know the basic concepts as part of overall project management. No one is asking you to go deep into understanding what involves behavior driven development, what are the steps in behavior driven development, what are the key roles in behavior driven development, etc., etc. You need not to go to that level of detail, but at least to know the basics and the foundational elements of these terms, so that at least you are able to differentiate between various agile best practices such as smoke testing, behavior driven development, feature driven development, information radiators, etc., etc. Okay, so I hope you will take this tip in consideration while you are preparing for your PMP exam. I hope you are finding this exercise helpful, right? Remember, the target is to get all the 5 out of the 5 questions correct. However, the minimum expectation is that you should get at least 4 out of the 5 questions correct, right? So here comes the 5th and the final question.
Right, so question number 5, guys, the 5th and the final one, the drill will remain the same. Please read the question and try to solve it before we take this together. You can pause the video here if you want to. Okay, so let's get started. A project involves rollout of a product in 7 different countries, and it is being led by the sponsor in one of the locations, or let's say one of the countries in this scenario. Midway during the project, the project manager is made aware that the quality management team from one of the countries is experiencing heavy workload and they cannot provide their initial level of commitment and involvement. Okay, so what it's happening is a project, it is spanning across 7 different countries. It's being led by a sponsor based out of one of the locations. Okay, now midway during the project, okay, now this phrase means that the project is in execution. Okay, very, very important takeaway. It is not in initiation, not in planning, but in execution. The project manager is made aware that the quality management team from one of the countries is experiencing heavy workload. So this team, which is the quality management team, they are a critical stakeholder, okay, of course, for the project, and they are experiencing some heavy workload. And the initial level of commitment and involvement they showed, that is about to change, probably going downhill from this point. Okay, so how should the project manager address this concern? Okay, so there are 4 options. Option A, transfer the risk by updating the stakeholder register, transfer the risk by updating the stakeholder engagement plan, mitigate the risk by updating the stakeholder register, mitigate the risk by updating the stakeholder engagement plan. So if I classify these 4 options, the first 2 options are talking about transferring the risk, and the next 2 options are talking about mitigating the risk. Okay, so now clearly it can be safely assumed that in such kind of scenarios you do not transfer a risk, right? Because what is essentially a risk transfer? A risk transfer is something where you are sometimes not capable of taking the risk both from a monetary standpoint or from an infrastructure standpoint, and that is why you pay someone to take up that risk for you. A typical case in point would be insurance. Okay, let's say a car insurance. So here you are transferring the risk of your car accident to be picked up by an insurance company. So that is a classic example of transferring the risk. However, in this scenario, it is not reasonable to assume that you transfer a risk, or let's say buy out an insurance product, or let's say sort of pay someone to take the ownership of your quality management team from one of your locations not getting involved, right? So that doesn't happen that way. So that's first part of the argument. Now the second part is, and I think this is the more stronger reason of rejecting option A and option B, you do not transfer a risk by updating the stakeholder register. Okay, you do not sort of transfer a risk by updating the stakeholder engagement plan. So it's a wrong artifact being referred to if you are planning to transfer a risk. Okay, so that is why option A and option B both are incorrect. Now that leaves us with option C and option D. Mitigate the risk by updating the stakeholder register and mitigate the risk by updating the stakeholder engagement plan. Now, if you go to the basic definitions of a stakeholder engagement plan and stakeholder register, and that can be found in, let's say, page 239 of your process group practice guide, that will essentially give you the answer to this question. Okay, so if you read the stakeholder engagement plan, what is it, right? So it is a component of the project management plan that identifies the strategies and actions required to promote productive involvement of stakeholders in decision making and execution. Okay, and it is very important that the stakeholder engagement plan may include, but of course it's not limited to, specific strategies or approaches for engaging with individual stakeholders or groups of stakeholders. Now, who is your group of stakeholder here? It is your quality management team from one of the locations, right? So that is the artifact you need to refer to, or you need to use in terms of mitigating that risk, and sort of have a risk response strategy that what you are going to do now, because one of your critical stakeholders is not showing the level of involvement which initially was committed. Okay, so that is why option D seems like a more plausible answer choice. Okay, however, let's take a step back and study what stakeholder register consists of. Okay, so the stakeholder register, again, it's a project artifact document. It is prepared in the initiation stage of the project. Okay, and it talks about the identification, assessment, classification of stakeholders, and this document contains information, for example, the identification of the stakeholder, assessment information, stakeholder classification. Okay, whether it is high impact, high influence stakeholder, high impact, high interest stakeholder, etc., etc. Okay, so you do these kind of classifications in your stakeholder register. Now, when you initially classified your quality management team as a part of the question, you classified them, let's say, as part of a high impact, high influence stakeholder. Okay, however, now in terms of the engagement, which is your stakeholder engagement plan, in terms of the engagement, it is very, very crucial that you are not getting the right kind of engagement which was initially committed. And that is why you revisit your stakeholder engagement plan and finalize a strategy in terms of how your stakeholder engagement plan will have an action now in terms of getting the right kind of mitigation actions for not having your quality management team getting involved. Now, that might be hiring an external consultant, or that might be using some of your internal quality resources from another country, and it can be 1001 options or 1001 sort of actions which you can take. But the guiding document in this scenario will be your stakeholder engagement plan, which can be referred to, and it is very important for you to understand here that it can be referred to in the execution stage of the project, right, midway during the project, because a stakeholder engagement plan is not something that you create in the planning stage and forget about it, right? So that is definitely not the case. You create the plan, get it approved, and when you are in execution, if your engagement strategy from one of your stakeholder changes, you go back to it and sort of take let's say reference from the stakeholder engagement plan to develop any risk mitigation actions. And that is why option C is incorrect, because it is referring to an incorrect document to form a mitigation action. And stakeholder register, as we discussed, for right reasons, will not give you the action item, or let's say the guiding principles of how to drive engagement of a stakeholder. It can give you the initial classification of the stakeholders, but it will not give you the guiding principles of how to keep the stakeholder engaged. Okay, and that is why option C is incorrect, and the correct answer to this question is option D.
So that's the end of the quiz, guys. Let me know in the comment section below how much you were able to score. Okay, I'd be very, very interested to know that. Also, if you have scored less, please do not be demotivated. Okay, you just need a bit more preparation. Do a thorough analysis of your mistakes so that you get to know about your knowledge gaps and you are able to fix those on time. Okay, thank you for watching, and I will see you again next month with another session on PMP exam practice questions and answers. Have a nice day, and bye for now.